All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Rojas Reports. I've got my guest waiting there in the green room, so I'll bring Kevin on in just a minute. But I did want to do a little bit of business. For those of you who are watching, I've been trying all kinds of different schemes and everything on Patreon and YouTube. And so I do want to make sure and be more regular about informing you guys of how this all works. So right now, if you're watching on YouTube, you're watching live, and I'm going to be opening those up to the public now. I was having that kind of behind my paywall for my super high levels, Patreon and YouTube level, but because it's kind of a moving target, I'm working with the schedule of the interviewee that I've just decided, whenever I do something live, I'll open it up for everybody to watch. And then after it's live for a few days, so people can kind of check it out, I'll put it in the archives. And the archives, how do you get to it then? Well, you could be a subscriber on Patreon. There's 2 levels where you can just get the audio stuff or get the video and everything, or you can join right here on YouTube. So there's a little join button. It's always hard to point. I get the mirror that way. There's a little join button. You can hit that and subscribe. If you join, then you can get the archives and watch the videos later on. So do that right now while we're talking. In fact, probably in the chat right now, we've got some of our members. Hey, we've got all kinds of people. So that's how it works. But welcome so much to the Rojas Report. We have a wonderful guest today, and I'll bring him on right now. Welcome, Kevin Knuth.
Hello, thank you for having me. Thank you.
Dr. Kevin Knuth, a professor of associate professor of astrophysicist at SUNY Albany. Did I stumble? I kind of tripped over your title there.
That's great. It's more generally physics, but that's good. Yeah, thank you.
So it's great. I'm really happy that you have gotten involved with talking about the UAP topic. I don't know. Are you uncomfortable? I think I hear you use the term UFO quite a bit.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm a bit older. I mean, for me, Pluto's a planet, and they're UFOs. So that's all there is to it.
And how do you feel addressing that issue, the term UAP? Because it does seem kind of weird. Almost, it's just kind of always been kind of weird to me that, and it's true that the scientific community, obviously the military has picked up this term, and they're using the term UAP. The UK government did, as opposed to UFOs. Now, if anybody asks you what's a UAP, you're going to say it's a UFO.
Right.
Is there an advantage to that term? What do you think about that issue?
Well, I don't. At first, I thought it was rather silly to come up with a new term, but just watching how readily it's been adopted and how comfortable people are using it, especially compared to UFO, I think that it's probably done what they intended. I think that it had sidestepped some of the taboo associated with UFOs. So in some people's mind, I think that it's more that UFOs are all those old flying saucers that people saw in the 1940s and 50s. That's what Roswell was about. UAPs are what the Navy deals with, right? And I think that seems to be how people's mindsets is right now. And I think that in that sense, it's been successful in getting people to think about these things and talk about them openly.
Mm-hmm. Now, we both interact with this group called the Scientific Coalition for UAP Research, and it used to be UFO Research, and we changed the name. And it is kind of funny because I used to be opposed to changing to the UAP, the reason being that it just means the same thing, and it was actually the Air Force that came up with the term UFO. However, I have noticed, and we kind of were forced to do that because really it was just feedback, especially from scientists who were like, I don't feel comfortable with UFO. I don't want nothing to do with UFOs. UAPs, I'll get involved with something like that, but not UFOs.
That seems to be the case.
It's so weird. Well, it's been really nice that you've been involved discussing UFOs and UAPs and everything in between in the last couple of months or years, I should say. And I've seen now 3 of your lectures, and I just think it's invaluable to have someone like you getting involved with this. And one of the things that we did at the UFO Congress, which you were at, I've got my UFO Congress hat here, is we had a panel with Diana Pasolka and Tim Brigham, also people with their doctoral degrees in some sort of science. They're more in the social sciences. But it's not an easy thing. Like, what prompted you to kind of take a more active and, in a way, public role in all of this?
That's a good question. I've always been interested in these, in UFOs, and way back to my teen years, or even as an older kid watching In Search of, on TV and things like this. So I've always found them interesting and wondered about what is the situation. And it was when I started in graduate school at Montana State University in Bozeman, Montana. I started that's where I got my master's in physics from. I started in graduate school there. It would have been September of 1988. And it was within the first couple of weeks that there was a cattle mutilation in the area where 2 cows were killed and surgically, whatever. There were some pretty horrible things done to these cows. Uh-huh. And it was very strange. It was not something you would expect anybody to do. And and I'd never heard of cattle mutilations before. I come from Wisconsin originally. I've heard of cow tipping, but not cattle mutilations. Who would mutilate a cow? What a horrible thing. So on seeing that on the news, I was kind of confused by this and worried. And of course, there were the 2 main hypotheses were that there were aliens did it, or they were Satanists, right? Because there's so many Satanists running around mutilating cows. Mm-hmm. So none of that made any sense to me. It just all seemed kind of ridiculous. And so when I went to the university the next day, we got to talking about this in one of our graduate student offices, and the conversation kind of moved into the hallway and became very animated, and well, the rancher saw some weird lights in the sky, and so he thinks they were aliens, but then other people think they're Satanists, and I just remember thinking, this is all nuts. and many of the graduate students who were discussing this were all the people who had moved there mostly from other parts of the country or from other countries. And our general opinion was, the real worry was, what kind of crazy place have we just moved to? Because we're going to have to live here for another 3 to 5 years, right, to get our degrees. So, so if there's Satanists running around killing cows, this is worrisome, right? And if there's aliens killing cows, that's worrisome too. Or whatever the situation is, it's very odd. And
something weird is going on in Montana.
Yeah, and so one of the professors came out of his office and happened to see us, and I don't quite remember who it is. I think I have an idea who it is. I'm not going to name names, but he came down the hallway to find out what all the commotion was, and we told him what we were talking about, and he said, oh yeah, that's very strange. It happens from time to time, these cattle mutilations, and they never figure out what causes them or who did it, which is odd. And we all agreed. And then he said, but what's really strange, he said, I have some friends in the Air Force who are up at Malmstrom Air Force Base, and they have problems up at Malmstrom with UFOs flying over the ICBM missile sites and shutting down the missiles. And this just really stunned us. I mean, what response do you give to this, right? Here's, we're new graduate students. Here's one of our new professors telling us that they have problems with UFOs shutting down ICBM missiles. And to be honest, when he walked away, we laughed like crazy. I mean, this kind of became an inside joke. Anytime somebody said something weird, somebody else would interject. Yeah, but what's really going on is there's some UFOs shutting down missiles up at Malmstrom Air Force Base. So I heard about this in 1988. This is 1988. Now, I don't know when Robert Hastings started being more public with his research on UFOs shutting down nuclear weapons or hanging out at nuclear weapon sites. But I saw, I guess it was his press conference that he had in, 2010 or something like this. So it's around 2010 that he had a press conference. I didn't see it until a few years later. Actually, I watched it on YouTube. I was preparing for a course that I was teaching, an astrophysics course, and I had some students. I was talking about astrobiology, and I had some students who wanted to discuss the possibilities of there being, intelligent aliens, that maybe we could communicate with them, or they could travel to Earth. So I was just poking around on the internet just to, find some mostly research papers and things on SETI. And I happened to stumble on the press conference on YouTube that Robert Hastings had. And I was blown away. It was like, whoa, wait a minute. These guys are talking about events that happened. I think Robert Salas's, encounter happened something like 1965. And here I am seeing this press conference that was happened in 2010, and all I could think was like, I knew about this in 1988. How? So that's 30 years earlier. I had heard about this 30 years before this press conference, and I just couldn't shake the feeling that this can't be nonsense. This has to be real. There's no way you're going to have professionals, several generations of professionals working at a nuclear weapons site who make these claims. That's just not going to happen. And I thought, how wrong can they be? They're not going to be that wrong. We wouldn't be employing them to do something that important if they were that wrong. And so that really impacted me. And that, I think I probably saw the press conference probably around 2014 or so. And then it wasn't, and then of course, Lou Elizondo comes out with the ATIP revelation, was what, 2017, December 16th, 2017. So it was only just a couple of years later that that had happened. And then I was like, whoa, wait a minute, this is why. And all I could ask myself is, why have we been ignoring this for 50 years? These sightings have been happening these encounters have been happening with Air Force and with others, at least for 50 years. And we're all just pretending it's not real. That's madness. That's insane. I thought somebody should be looking into this. Somebody should be looking into it seriously. This shouldn't be kept secret, because when it's secret, it's compartmentalized. Not everybody knows about it. This is how you run into problems. This should be studied openly. So, and so just coincidentally, I had, around that time, I had given a talk to our department on UFOs, and probably the announcement, just the title of my talk, had made it, was on the internet to some degree. And I got a call from our media department in late May, I believe it was, of 2017. And somebody an editor from the online journal, The Conversation, wanted to find a physicist who would write an article about UFOs for World UFO Day. And they said, well, we'd like them to write an article about why people believe in UFOs, even though we know they're not real. And this is what I was told. And I thought, well, I'll have to think about this, for a little bit. And I kind of mulled it over, slept on it. And the next day I thought, well, this is really silly. I couldn't possibly write an article exactly like that, because we don't know that they're not real. We don't know this, and they ought to be studied, really. And so I called our media person. I said, yeah, please contact them. I'd be willing to write a paper, a short article on why scientists ought to study UFOs. I would be willing to do that. And the editor contacted me right away and was very excited. They said, oh, we never thought we'd find a physicist who would actually support these things. So when we asked to find a physicist, we wanted a physicist, we wanted, a professional scientist to make this easier for them. We thought to invite them to discuss why people believe in them, even though they're not real. But we're more than happy to hear why scientists should study them. So I wrote that article for the conversation, and I labored over it for the better part of a week, and had, my wife helped me edit it. She helped greatly, and some of my colleagues read it over and helped as well. And I worked very hard to make sure that, I stuck to the facts, kept clear that we don't know what these things are. We are agnostic as to, their nature. And just really tried to drive home the point that scientists study things. That's our job. We study things, and we should be studying these things. And so I guess by this time I felt very passionate about this, realizing that the Navy, the Navy's been having problems. They've been having problems at nuclear weapon sites for decades, and nobody knows anything about this. That's insane. It's insane and potentially dangerous. We don't know what the situation is, and we need to know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, the scientist in me is curious. I want to know what these things are. What are they? They, from the witness sightings, many of them do appear to be structured craft with really incredible flight characteristics and capabilities. And so, how do you do something like that? So there's a potential for a huge discovery here as well. And so, as a scientist, you never walk away from the potential for a big discovery. You would kick yourself forever for that. So I felt it was worth the risk.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that you've done. There's a little bit of echo there. That I think is really important and unique is that you've kind of demonstrated what sort of science can be done in this field. Because a lot of people have asked, well, is there even any science that could be done? But you have, and we'll get into that. But I kind of want to go in order. And what's kind of funny is the order of lectures I've seen are kind of opposite of kind of a good narrative, I think, because the last lecture you did is why doesn't science look into this stuff, which was great. You did that at the UFO Congress. And I want to talk about some of the points you made there. And I think the first important point is about the circular logic that kind of causes this catch-22 situation.
Yeah, there's a good bit of circular logic that's been applied here, which is frustrating to think about as a scientist. Scientists don't study UFOs because they're not scientific. Why aren't UFOs scientific? They're not scientific because scientists don't study them. And that's really all it comes down to. It's really that. It's a pretty tight circle, that bit of logic, but that's really what's going on. Scientists look back and say, nobody studied this, so it's not scientific. And so I'm not going to study it. And that's really not, it's really pretty ridiculous. Mm-hmm. And there are many examples of, scientific theories that are now well accepted that were treated this way initially. The theory of meteorites, rocks falling from the sky was one of them. And you can imagine why people claiming that rocks can fall from the sky, why people would look at them and say, you are crazy. There's no way rocks are going to fall from the sky. And so you can see why that would be a hard theory to accept. And it really wasn't accepted until you had a meteorite event that happened over a small town. I believe it was somewhere in Europe. I believe France, perhaps. where the meteorite broke into several pieces and actually hit. These pieces hit in different parts of the town simultaneously, and each one of them started a fire. So the townspeople have to put out these fires, and then they discover this strange rock here. And there were multiple rocks found, each one found associated with a fire. So the geologists then looked at them and said, well, these aren't from this area. They're clearly not from the area. So that it wasn't until you had an event where many people saw these things come in, many people saw them start fires, many people saw the rocks, and there were multiple rocks. It was just, you couldn't deny it anymore. And so then scientists look at them and study them, and we learn about meteorites, and that's really all there is to it.
That's another good point, because the other, and this kind of, and this will definitely be a thing, because I want to talk about kind of the state of affairs right now and how science can and should play a role. But you also talked about the other aspect is then when you want to start to study a phenomena, you have to prove that there even is a phenomena there. When you, like you just mentioned, when the rocks started falling and stuff caught on fire, they said, oh, there is a phenomena here to study. However, with a lot of other stuff, we just have anecdotal information. And I, like you talked about your buddy Mark, who calls it anecdata, but that really isn't scientific data. So how do you justify something as real? And really what I think you made this point is that the Navy's kind of done that now. They've talked about UFOs being real.
Yeah, that's been the big, that was the big news. The big news really wasn't those videos. Those videos aren't that spectacular. The pilot's description of the behavior of these objects do not at all, that's not what's shown on the videos that we got to see, and which is disappointing. It looks like we were given the most boring parts of the video. But that's exactly right. One of the differences that one of the features that we use to decide whether something is a science or a pseudoscience, in pseudoscience, the focus is usually on trying to prove that something exists, that something is real. And the problem with something new, like studying UFOs, is that the first thing you do need to do is to prove that there's a phenomena here to study. And so a lot of your activity looks like pseudoscience. Now I want to be careful here, because with UFOs, there is a lot of pseudoscience going on, right? So there is a lot of pseudoscience there. And so that makes it even harder, because it's hard for a scientist to come in and do science, and especially when the first steps are to prove that there is a phenomenon, because the scientist will look very much like everybody else, and that makes it difficult. Now, the Navy has basically done this for us, which is excellent. They've done so out of necessity. They have from my understanding, they have a serious problem on their hands. You can't have, and I believe it was 2015, they had near daily encounters with these things. And we can't afford that. And some of these were happening in the Persian Gulf while they were going on, on missions into Syria. You've got to fly past UFOs first, and then you enter Syria and complete your mission and come back. But you have to be on your game in Syria. But your pilots aren't going to be on their game if they've got, objects flying at their airplanes at thousands of miles an hour and doing barrel rolls around the cockpit. There's, that's unreasonable. So the Navy had a real problem that it needed to solve. And we've, unfortunately, from, my perspective, which I'm not privy to most of the information that the government has. I'm a scientist, a public scientist. So, but my perception is that these things have gone ignored for 50 years, and they've been ignored until there was a serious problem. And this serious problem seems to be the problem that the Navy has encountered with their pilots. And now I would have imagined that the nuclear weapon site incursions would have been a serious problem. These things kind of worry me, because you you can have a craft fly over an ICBM missile and shine lights down into it and then fly away and nobody does anything. I don't know if you want that information out public, because it says to me that anybody can fly a drone over one of these ICBM missile sites and take photographs and shine lights on, and nobody's going to do anything because they're going to say, "Oh, it's just one of those UFOs again," and
which
we don't believe in that.
So
we don't believe in that, so we're not going to do anything. I mean, that's really what it looks like, and it's a little worrisome. I would have hoped that our defense would have been a little smarter in this respect. And perhaps, and of course, I don't know what they do, and I don't know what they know and don't know. So I can't really present an objective, picture here. But from somebody from the outside, that's kind of what it looks like.
And I think the difference here, a lot of people are asking, I should say, welcome everybody. We've got Rodrigo and Mark and Cartola and Will and Sonia and the Unidentified Celebrity Show, and people all over. We've got Canada and UK, Australia. So welcome everybody. And some of them are mentioning some of the people who have done some science in the past, but these are kind of one-off individuals who have taken it upon themselves, like a Jacques Vallée or Dr. Eric Davis. People are mentioning some of these people. And sure, they have taken it upon themselves to do this. But what's different now is that, to your point, it's kind of been made official that UFOs at least exist. It is a phenomenon. Even if you're a scientist who doesn't believe it's anything abnormal, it's still, then incumbent upon you as a scientist to demonstrate that, to say, Navy's got this all wrong. This isn't so weird. Here's the science why that's the case. So at least now it's legit, I guess.
The phenomenon exists. This is something that some people have to deal with, and they would like to know what it is. And how it's a simple matter of figuring out what some of these things are. And of course, you have to be careful, because not all UFOs are going, even if some of them are alien spacecraft, they're not all alien spacecraft. Some of them are misidentifications. In fact, the vast majority are misidentifications. I don't believe that the Navy's misidentifying birds, flying at their planes at thousands of miles an hour. I don't think that that's the case, but clearly, which is what makes the Navy much more believable. But it is true that people do misidentify planets and think they're a UFO or birds. I've actually seen photographs. I'm a bird watcher. I've been bird watching since I was 5 years old, so I'm very familiar with birds. And there was a library of compelling UFO photos that I had come across. And in going through those, I found 3 photographs of birds. So it was to me kind of surprising, but that's how it is. And a lot of these things are misidentifications. I have yet to see swamp gas. I've never in my life seen swamp gas hovering about doing whatever it supposedly does. So there gets to be a point where the skeptics' explanations are far more ridiculous than the other possibilities. So but some of these things do appear to be structured craft, and those are the cases I'm interested in.
Mm-hmm. And I think it was really interesting too when you brought up Earth lights. This whole, you knew the
earthquake lights, yes.
Yeah, the guy who's talking about the earthquake lights and doing that research, which was another kind of something that people didn't believe existed until later on. Finally, the evidence came that there were observations
years ago, which is really amazing. Yeah,
mm-hmm. Which is also interesting because some of these things are. I mean, even of course, the UFO community was like, "Well, it's not even proven. There are no such thing as earthquake lights."
Right
now, we know there are.
Ball lightning is another example. Ball lightning is not well understood in the physics community, and it is taboo to study ball lightning. because it's such a weird thing that not everybody believes is real. So there are, some of the explanations that people have put forward, as, that, that was probably just ball lightning. Well, ball lightning is not really a thing either. I feel that way when people say, it's probably just a mass hallucination. Well, I don't think there's no such thing as a mass hallucination either. So it gets very.
And if there
silly.
was, then you're promoting psychic phenomena, because there would have to be some sort of psychic connection these people would have. So
exactly, yeah. It gets to be very interesting when you look at the wide variety of cases and possible explanations.
And one of the issues is, and it's just so important, and we'll get back to why what the Navy did was so important and how that changes things. But prior to that, like we're talking about, to prove something really is a phenomena, you have to rely on a lot of anecdotal information, or which, like you made the point, isn't really scientific data, and which I think is important for people to understand also.
Yeah, that is important to understand. The difficulty is that, unfortunately, in most cases, that's all you have to go on. And so the best you can do is to, look at an anecdotal report and of what somebody says they saw or says they experienced, and try to make sense of it. That is a reasonable thing to do, to try to make sense of it, but you have to keep in mind that people make mistakes, and there are fabrications and hoaxes and things like this too. So it's very challenging. But I like to, in some of the more prominent cases, I've often asked myself, especially when there's professionals involved, like pilots, where there's a real consequence for them being wrong or even reporting these things. The question I ask myself is, how wrong could they be? How wrong can I expect that could be? So even with the the UAP footage from the 2004 Nimitz case, I did, and presumably we'll talk about this a bit, but I did some work to estimate the acceleration in the end of that video. And to do that, I had to know the size of the object. And of course, we don't have data on the size of the object. We have anecdotal data from the pilots, several pilots, I think up to 6 pilots who have seen these things in that one event, in that day, who described them as being about the size of an F-18, about 40 to 50 feet in length. And these tic-tac shaped objects. And so I use that number, 40, 50 feet. Now, the first question you ask yourself as a scientist when, I'm done with the analysis, and when I did the analysis with those numbers, I found that at the end of the video, when the computer loses lock and the object flies off to the left, that I estimated that acceleration to be about 80 Gs, about 80 times the acceleration of gravity, which is really unreasonable. It's still not the highest that's been observed, but in fact, it's on the low end of some of the actual data we have, or from either radar data or from anecdotes. But the first question I asked myself then is, well, that number depends on the size of the tic-tac objects, right? So, and of course you think, well, how wrong could the pilots be? What if it wasn't 40 feet long and it was only 30 feet long? Well, then it's accelerating away at 60 G, which is still unreasonable. At what point does it become a more reasonable acceleration? Well, when you get it down to around 8G, maybe you might be able to imagine somebody pulling off something with a craft or a drone at 8G. But then the object would have had to be 4 feet long and only, 100 feet in front of the plane, which wasn't the case. The pilot's not going to be that wrong. He's not off by a factor of 10 on the size of the craft, or the size of the tic-tac. So I think that using a 40-foot length is a reasonable thing to do. And
And to put that in perspective, I think you made the point that some of our newer aircraft, fighter jets, 13 Gs, they'll fall apart.
Oh yeah, you can't. Most of our fighter jets, you can't accelerate more than 13 Gs of acceleration. The wings will rip off. Missiles can't maneuver at accelerations beyond 30 G. They can. I think their frames of some missiles can withstand about 60 Gs of acceleration, but they can't maneuver under those conditions. So the fact that you have a video where this thing accelerated at 80 G is really significant. Now I ask myself, I think why did the Navy release that video and not one of the more exciting ones where, like, the pilots, Fravor described these things as bouncing around like a ping pong ball inside of a jar. I would love to see a video of that. That's not been released. Nothing like that's been released. And I suspect that the 2004 Nimitz footage that was released appears to be quite boring. I mean, the thing just sits there in front of the plane for most of it, and the plane zooms in. They change the magnification a few times, and it moves around, and then it flies off the screen. It loses lock and flies off the screen. And when it flies off the screen, that visually looking at that as a movie, it's not that impressive. It's not until you do the numbers and you think that, well, the computer lost missile lock. That's not easily done. These things are made to track missiles, and missiles can't accelerate very fast. So clearly this was a high acceleration. But I think we lucked out. I think that, when they chose to release that video, the people reviewed the video maybe didn't do the calculations to figure out what that acceleration was. And I believe that, if I remember right, some of the metadata was missing. I think there was metadata to distance to object, and that was actually missing from the video. So unfortunately, we had estimates. Fortunately, we had estimates from the pilot as to how big this thing was so that we could get that acceleration.
Mm-hmm. Some people were saying, kind of criticizing, because I think you posted that paper, I think with Robert Powell and Peter Reale from
Yep.
SCU. And you posted it in your journal, Entropy, and they were questioning, well, how could you call this like a scientific paper if it's mostly based off of anecdotal information? But I guess it's more of an analysis, though, and you have to take into consideration in this part, it is anecdotal information, but it's from kind of in legal terms, it'd be like an expert witness.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So to be clear, and this is a good place to be clear about this, we published it in the journal Entropy. I presented this at the MaxEnt 2019 meeting at the Institute for Plasma Physics in Garching, Germany, and so that conference was organized by the people at the Max Planck Institute. And they were now, they had already, I've gone to that conference for 20 years, so I'm familiar with all of these people, and they had an agreement that year that the proceedings for the conference were going to be published by the journal Entropy. The topics are the same type of topics, so it was a reasonable thing to do. Now, and so I wrote up the proceedings paper with Peter and Robert, and it then went for review, was reviewed by several people with the conference organizers as the guest editors. So the conference organizers made the decision to have the paper published based on the reviews that they received. So even though, there's been some notes, some things written, well, he had it published in the journal where he's editor-in-chief, so that it's a little fuzzy, but what really happened is it was, yes, I am the editor-in-chief, but the guest editors are in charge of their special issue, and that's where it got published. So why did I publish there and not somewhere else? Basically, I used some of the data analysis techniques that we talk about at that conference to analyze that video. And so I saw that as an opening for, this is my chance to get to talk about UFOs or UAPs to fellow scientists, where I'm actually using the data analysis techniques that we're all familiar with to analyze these videos from the U.S. Navy, and I saw that as an opportunity. But because I've been involved with that community for a long time, I'm the editor-in-chief of that journal, so so skeptics very readily pointed out, well, he got it published in his own journal and blah blah blah, but the paper was reviewed by others, and some of the reviewers had very good comments, and that we took into account in editing the paper.
Yeah, how did your colleagues take that? I mean, what was the feedback you got? You're laughing, so some of it must have been
No, it's interesting. I think that of course people are skeptical, and of course scientists are going to be skeptical, and they should be, and that's reasonable. I think I was pleased. I did a very what I felt to be a careful job in the analysis and my presentation, and most of my colleagues were very supportive. They said, I think their eyes were kind of opened and thought, wow, this is from the U.S. Navy, and this is really interesting. And yeah, you're right. That has to be about an ADG acceleration. And well, what is this all about? What's really going on here? And I think that their curiosity was piqued, which was exactly what needed to happen. I did have one colleague. He's been a friend for years and still is, and he's very emotional, and he stood up and he says, "Oh, I can't believe you're involved with this nonsense." He said, he said, you could show me a UFO and give me a tour, and I still wouldn't believe it. and
it's such a weird thing to say, which kind of brings me to the next topic.
Well, he kind of helped my case there. Because he said that, and some of my colleagues were upset with him because he was like, "Oh, this was a good talk and that was good work. You should, sit down and be quiet." But I was able to play on this. I said, but this is the problem with extreme skepticism. Extreme skepticism is its own religion. You aren't going to believe it no matter what the data is. So, and that's really the problem. So his statement, it couldn't have been better. If I was scheming, I could have paid him a few bucks to say something like that, so to make the point. But no, it was actually him. It was actually him. He said that, and he believed it, and that's fine. But go ahead. Oh, but I was going to say, but I do have other close colleagues. Some of them who weren't at that meeting, who have seen, read my paper and looked, saw the talk because it was recorded, and who very strongly believe that these things are artifacts. One of them is a close colleague, a close friend of mine at NASA. He's still at NASA Ames. He's been there for far longer than I had been there. I was there for 4 years. And he really believes that these things are artifacts, and that's hard to argue. I mean, I have to, I am going to have to, you have to think very carefully about what kind of proof do I need to convince him that this is not an artifact, that this is actually a structured craft, what's going to be required. And I think, in some sense that I'm lucky to have a friend like this, because I can, I felt I could bounce these ideas off of him and send him my papers or my talks to have him comment on them, so I know what skeptics are going to say or think, or a skeptical scientist is going to say or think. But he actually didn't want to have the conversation. He said, "I've argued, for years." I think he's friends with Jacques Vallée, and so, because they're both in Silicon Valley, right? And he says, "I've had these arguments for years. I don't want to have them anymore." So so it's too bad. It's unfortunate.
Although in this case, I mean, we don't know much about the equipment that was used because it's classified. However, there certainly have been plenty of, or I know of FLIR experts who've talked about, you just don't see that sort of artifact, especially in this sort of high-end equipment, cutting-edge equipment. Not like that. Those are some pretty big, blatant
And you don't expect to have an artifact that the pilot can also see and follow with his plane, and that is being tracked by radar. You don't. It's not a single artifact. There's something, there could be something more complicated going on. I think one of the more interesting explanations, technological explanations, that one of the reviewers to my paper actually mentioned. He claimed that what if you had somebody shining lasers up and intersecting lasers, so you're basically ionizing a patch of air, and then you can basically move the lasers very fast, and basically this ionized patch of air will move, and this ionized air will be hot, so it'll show up on an infrared video. You would see it on your FLIR camera. It would be giving off light, so the pilot would see it, and ionized air will reflect radio waves, so the radar would pick it up. And I thought that was an excellent hypothesis. The problem is that the Navy is in control of that territory. They know there were no other ships in the area. The tic-tac objects interacted with the planes. So if somebody is playing around with laser beams, they're going to have to be monitoring where the planes are and what the planes are doing so that they can have their fun. But there were no other radar systems operating in the area. So no, you don't, and then there's no place to shine the lasers from. So there's a lot of problems with that hypothesis. I don't think it, we argued in the paper that it didn't hold up. It was a good guess, a nice try, but.
Yeah, someone brought up another skeptic, Mick West, and asked if you had looked at his stuff, although I know Mick West does not look at the anecdotal information, just the videos themselves. But there's not a lot of data you can get out of the videos themselves, it doesn't seem.
You can't get any speeds or accelerations of the object without knowing how big it is or how far away it is from the camera. That's really the fact. And so we needed to use the estimated size, from the pilots. And yes, that's a weak point, but as I mentioned, you can then ask the question, how far off could they be? If they're off by a factor of 10, it's still accelerated at 8G, which is a hefty acceleration. For a 4-foot object that's flying a few hundred feet in front of the plane, that we still don't know how it's flying, and you still don't see any evidence of propellant. So there's still, the same questions are still in play. What is that thing? And how is it flying, and how is it moving?
And you bring up the point, pseudoscience, kind of the definition and the difference between regular science and pseudoscience. It can happen on both sides. I mean, on the extreme skepticism, as well as, of course, and what people usually think of pseudoscience is those speculating out in the public, which, like you said, there's a lot of that going on in the UFO field, but it can happen on both ends. And maybe explain that. What is the difference between pseudoscience and real science?
Oh gosh, that's a really
you'd have to look at your slide.
I'm going through my slides to remind myself, because it's,
I was going to say I can read it to you.
It's tricky, right? I mean, yeah, so
pseudoscience seeks confirmation, science seeks falsification, is what you wrote.
Right, that's what it was. I knew that there was a really nice summary. Yeah, so yeah, pseudoscience, you seek confirmation. You're trying to confirm your theory, confirm the idea. And science, we work hard to falsify things. Can I show that this is wrong? What experiment can I do to show that that idea is wrong? And and it's what doctors do when doctors are doing medical tests. You have your ankle hurts, and they write you a script to get an X-ray. And what does it say? It says R/O, right? They write R/O, broken foot. And so what does the R/O stand for? It means rule out. So doctors are, coming down to making a diagnosis by ruling out other possible diagnoses. And that's what we do as scientists. So pseudoscientists aren't out there falsifying, they're out trying to prove their case, whereas scientists are falsifying things. So can I rule out the idea that this was a structured craft? And that's a good question. So now you look at these videos and you look at those accelerations, and another colleague of mine here at UAlbany, she said very, very correctly, she said, clearly you can't accelerate a craft at 80 G through the air without a sonic boom. So that rules out the hypothesis that it's a structured craft. And that's difficult to argue against, right? Because that's very logical. The argument against it is, well, we're hypothesizing that there are craft that can accelerate that fast and do this sort of thing. But so that would be what somebody who's trying to prove that it's an alien spacecraft would be having to do. But you don't try to prove that something. A scientist doesn't try to prove that it's an alien spacecraft. We try to rule out other things, and that's what we try to do. Or we present a hypothesis and you show, well, there is support for that hypothesis. Can we come up with something that will rule out,
That's where people get frustrated with me, but it's the same thing when they send me pictures or videos or, I'll say, I can't rule out that that's not a planet or a star. I can't rule out that that's not a bug or a bird. And they get frustrated.
Insects are really interesting in videos. They come really close to the camera and it looks really impressive.
and birds. And I've done this. In fact, there's a video I have. In fact, I do it with this UFO. But a bird flying by will look just like that when they zoom by. So and this is what happens the most is people look at their vacation pictures and they see something that looks like this.
Yeah.
Fuzzy in the background. And they're like, I didn't even see that UFO. There's a flying disc. But no, it's just a bird zooming by very quickly. And that's what it's
very, very easily could be a swallow. And it's just close and looks bigger. And
So along the lines with the data and how things change right now is that, what's interesting to me is that you talk about the importance of the Navy kind of making UFOs officially making them a thing. And that I know was one of Chris Mellon's goals with his effort, working with To the Stars. He worked with the SSCI, the Senate Intelligence Committee, for those of you who don't know. And so he's got a background doing this, and he had this strategy. He's worked with the Senate Intelligence Committee, and he's like, as soon as we can make this official and public, that justifies the government then to say, hey, Navy, this is real. Tell us about it. You haven't told us about this yet. Why not? And of course, their answer, which makes sense, I think, would be that, well, we don't think there's anything to it. So that's why we haven't told you, or we haven't felt it's been important enough, which is fair. And then they've just got to make that argument. But the one thing we don't know is the data. So the Navy is saying this is not Chinese, this is Russian, this is unidentified, but we have really very little to none of their data. We don't know what data they use to come to that determination. We have a little bit of it. Certainly, they most likely use that anecdotal. Well, certainly they use the information you used in your report, but they likely had a lot more, but we don't have access to that data.
Right.
Nor do we even know what it is.
Yeah. And unfortunately, even if we did have access to it, it wouldn't be scientifically useful in the sense that you wouldn't have access to those instruments. You wouldn't be able to know the characteristics of that instrument to be able to, really pin down what's going on in the recording. And that would be challenging. And plus these videos weren't recorded in a controlled setting. They're recorded. These are being recorded on the fly while everybody is excited and holy beep, what is this thing? So it's not a controlled setting, and it's going to be extremely difficult to get any recordings in a controlled setting. Anybody, I imagine, I'm working with UAPX, and we're hoping to go out. We're aiming to go out on 2 research vessels out on the Pacific Ocean, just south of Catalina Island, in the same area, and look for these things.
Just right over there, a few miles.
Oh, really? Yeah, right. Nice. Yeah, so we hope to do this sometime next year, and we're going to do our best to record. If we see something, we're going to record. Everything we can, but it depending on how impressive the an encounter is. I can't ensure that I'm not going to be like, oh my god, and be. It's hard to stay controlled and to keep everything calm so that you're getting the best data you can and that are understanding the situation. This is one reason why I'm interested in using satellites. Some of these objects that have been observed are, a 40 foot tic tac. That's pretty big. You could see that by satellite, but there are reports of 300-foot disks and things like that, from pilots. And of course, the skeptics are like 300-foot disks. Well, yeah, but when how wrong is a pilot going to be? When in some cases, for the Japanese Airlines case over Anchorage, Alaska in 1986, he said it filled the whole, his entire view was taken up by the object. That's big, and so that should be observable by satellite and easily observable by satellite. And so. Can we look for these things? Can we find them? And then you might be able to take a ground-based sighting, even from regular citizens who normally wouldn't be very credible, but you might get somebody who happened to get a photograph from the ground, and then you go back at that time and day and look for satellite imagery, and there's your satellite image of the object. You can verify whether there's been a sighting or not. So there you can falsify, falsify claims using satellite data, and I think that's about as objective as we're going to be able to be in the near future, I think.
And you were featured in a space.com article just in the last couple of days, written by Leonard David, a good dude. Yep. I talked to and a great article where you were talking about that with Philippe, and he presented that, I remember, at the SCU conference a couple years ago. But the data is an important part. So let's talk about if you were working for the UAP task force. Now, presumably, I think what they're going to be looking for is mostly foreign technology, drones, that sort of thing. But they'll run across some unidentifieds, and we're not sure even what they're going to do completely with those. But let's say you're on the group. Let's pass this to Kevin's unidentified group. How would you go about doing some scientific investigation on these things? Like you said, it might be really difficult, even if you're the United States Navy.
Yeah, you're going to want to get high quality images of the objects in as many wavelengths as possible. So you would want infrared imagery. You're going to want visual imagery. You're going to want, you want to be able to pick up X-rays and gamma rays if they're there. You're going to want to see all of these things. What kind of light, if the object's emitting light, what kind of light is it? How is the light being generated? You can figure that out by looking at the spectrum of the light. So you're going to want to record spectrum, and over wide, very broad frequency ranges or wavelengths. And you're going to, and if you do have something like X-rays or gamma rays, you're going to want to check for other types of particles. Is this thing, generating particles around it? Are there alpha particles, beta particles, anything else? So you're going to want to detect things like that. There's a lot of things you would like to do in the ideal case. Whether the Navy is, or anybody is going to be set up with all of that equipment in any one situation is very unlikely. So it's difficult. Mm-hmm. It's difficult to study things that you can't control. And this is really why this topic is as difficult to study as all the others that are difficult to control. Mm-hmm. You have to, you can't just study supernovae. You can't study a supernova. I'm just going to go study a supernova. Well, there isn't one to look at. You've got to wait till one happens, right? And so fortunately, they are common enough in the nearby galaxies that we can wait for them and look for them. Earthquakes. It's hard to have the equipment all the equipment you want set up to study an earthquake. When Friedman Freund was looking at trying to study earthquake lights, he has to have certain equipment set up where there's going to be an earthquake. That's hard to do. So that's really the difficulty with
UFOs. Not
UFOs.
impossible.
If not impossible. And UFOs are, especially if you've only got a fraction of UFOs turn out to be something interesting like an alien spacecraft or an alien probe, if it's only a fraction of those, then it's going to be impossible to have all of your equipment in the right place at the right time to detect these things. You're better off monitoring for them coming in, from somewhere else or however they approach Earth or whatever. So it's extremely challenging, and it's not clear that there's any easy answer. I mean, this really could take a long time to figure out.
And the resources that you'd need would need to be extraordinary. Fortunately, the military has, assets and observation equipment throughout the world, around the entire planet. And it would take that sort of ability to be able to capture even probably a small amount of data.
Right.
Now, when it comes to the data, now you've been doing some science around this, mostly some computer modeling to kind of speculate or on the nature of who might be coming here and their technology. And I think that's really interesting. And what's interesting about that is it demonstrates this is some science that we can do right now, even without all this other data.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I wanted to do something, and so I can't just go collect data right now. So I really thought, what can we do? And so one of the things I could thought about doing is I could try to model a civilization exploring some region of the galaxy, right? And the idea then is to so what I had done in this project is I modeled about 2 million civilizations, and I kept track, and they each had slightly different characteristics. They could travel at different speeds or different accelerations. They could withstand the longer journeys or some of them shorter journeys and things like this. And so I just looked to see what would happen if you had a civilization that started colonizing other star systems and spreading out. Now, we're, of course, not at that point yet, but we're working towards that, right? And so after 2 million simulations of this, I then looked to see in my simulated galaxy, Earth is there. So I looked to see how many of those simulated civilizations actually found Earth. And so, and for those civilizations that did find Earth, I looked to see what their characteristics were, what allowed them to pull it off. So I'm not going to be remember all the results off the top of my head, of course, but the chance of finding Earth is very slim. It's literally down into fractions of tenths of a percent. And the
kind of answering the Fermi paradox a bit.
Yeah, the problem is the galaxy's big. You've got
really
300 billion stars, and to happen upon Earth is almost impossible. And so that really, that to me was a bit surprising. It was much harder to find Earth than I expected it would be. When I first just started the project, I realized I had to literally go out to millions of civilizations before you had any number of them finding Earth. And the algorithms I used actually pared down and focused on civilizations that had a better chance of finding Earth. So that made it a bit easier. But it ended up being something like 1 out of 10 million, 1 out of 8 million chance of finding Earth. And then once I had a set of civilizations that did find Earth in my simulations, I could look at what their characteristics were. So it didn't depend very much on their speed or acceleration. They just had to be able to go fast enough to get to nearby stars. That didn't seem to, once you could go much faster than others, that didn't do much for you. They just have to be able to perform interstellar travel. That's really all that you needed there. And then it turned out that the probability for their origin turned out to be that they originated from within 10,000 light years of here, which is a good distance. The galaxy is about 150,000 light years across. So I use this to get some idea of, if we do have aliens visiting Earth, what can we expect them to be like? And so I have some answers there, which, from these simulations, which I'm now working on writing up to hopefully publish. And so what would they be like? Well, they're probably from nearby. They're probably from within 10,000 light years of here originally. It turns out that they've probably been coming to Earth for a long time. They probably discovered Earth a long time ago, on the order of more than 250,000 years ago. So certainly have known about Earth throughout human history. That's almost a certainty. And so there were some interesting facts that came out from these simulations, which was quite fun.
So I do want to ask about, first, I guess I'll ask real quick this question that someone just posted, and that's what I was looking up the details of. And they said, why so little attention has been paid to Scientific American changing their positions at UAP are deserving of genuine research? I think the article they're referring to was the one by
Ravi. Jacob Misra and Ravi.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, yeah.
Although it's an opinion piece,
right? No, they're both SETI researchers, and after that article came out, I contacted them. Well, I was actually presenting at a meeting that they helped to organize. They organized a SETI session at the European Astronomical Society meeting this summer. And so their article came out about the same time. And Philippe Aileris and I had already had our abstract accepted to be presented there. So we were going to be talking about looking for technosignatures. We call them, extraterrestrial or technosignatures using satellites in the near Earth environment. And so, since they had organized the meeting and they had just published that opinion piece, I contacted them. So we've been in touch and talked about what can be done, what needs to be done, and things like this. So there are more scientists now getting interested, and that's really exciting. Well, and you and I are both affiliated with SCU, the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. So this is another group of scientists that are interested in studying these things.
When it comes to the scientific community, and the UAP task force, what ideally would you like to see? Because we have no indication, at least we do have a little bit of indication that it doesn't seem like they're going to be in a kind of a mode to regularly share information with the public. There's been a couple of statements that their work will be classified and their results will be classified. But right. I mean, would you like to see some of that information shared with the public, perhaps the scientific community?
I think it would be in their best interest to share it with the scientific community. And in fact, I had written a letter with Jacob and Ravi and Matthew Shadagas, from one of my colleagues here at UAlbany, to send to those on the UAP task force to request that they share information with the scientific community. So I think that's very important. Unfortunately, it's very easy for the people who do classified work have this mindset that the most important work that happens is classified work. And that's unfortunately, it's not really true. And part of that comes from drinking their own Kool-Aid. They have to convince people that they have to convince the people who give them money that what we do is the most important thing. And so they end up believing that. But if you look at breakthroughs don't happen that way as often as they do other ways. Breakthroughs are kind of random. You had the airplane was developed by two bicycle mechanics, right? The theory of relativity came from a patent clerk. These are people out in the community. So so it would be in their best interest to have the scientific community working on this problem and thinking on this problem. In fact, I would be supportive of something more like a Manhattan Project style effort where we take this seriously and let's find out what these things are. I mean, if it really does turn out that even one of these objects was an alien probe, that's something we're going to want to know about. And something we ought to take seriously as a planet, as humanity. I know, 2020 has thrown a lot at us this year, but, if it turns out that we find out that there are aliens visiting Earth, that's probably the biggest problem we'll have on our hands. And I don't mean problem, and I say problem, but it's a potential problem. You have to make sure it's not a problem. And the only way to do that is to educate ourselves. We have to find out, what are these things? If some of them turn out to be alien craft, then where did they come from? What are they doing here? What do they want? Are they just studying us? Do they appear to be friendly? That's good, but I don't know if I'm not willing to, is that a risk we're worth taking? Just to say, well, they haven't done anything yet, so they're probably fine, so we'll just ignore them, right? And
which seems to be potentially what is going on.
What's going on, right?
Yeah.
But but we don't do that about Russians. I mean,
yeah.
Russians haven't done anything to us for a while, so we'll just kind of ignore them, and I'm sure it'll be fine. No, we know better, and and I think that I don't like painting them. If they exist, if they are somebody visiting Earth, I don't want to paint them as a threat. We don't know that they're a threat, but anything is a potential threat, and we need to be informed. That's what the situation needs to be.
I agree, because I think that's the best case scenario with what's going on right now. The worst case scenario is that the Senate Intelligence Committee gets their report. The public facing one maybe has a few stats, not much. Then the Senate Intelligence Committee says, hey, looks good to us. You guys got this all well taken care of. Keep on keeping on. And then we're all still left in the dark. Right. I think the best case scenario would be some cooperation with an organization where they are sharing data so that there can be some transparent scientific investigation on the true anomalies. But it's hard to separate that from the data that should remain classified that could potentially pose a genuine threat.
Right. Yeah, I think there, there's several difficulties. If you do have alien craft visiting Earth, there's the technology aspect. This technology is going to be powerful, and there's going to be people who are going to be worried about it falling in the wrong hands. So they won't want to share information. But the difficulty is that other countries are looking into this too. We're not the only ones, collecting data here. So I think it really is better to share. It'd be better for all of us to get the technology at the same time than for any one of us to get the technology over the others, I think. But I'm not an expert in this.
So where do we go from here? For those in the UFO community, for instance, how do they advocate for this? I think that, calling the White House and saying, we know that you're making deals with aliens, let us in, is probably not the way to go. It hasn't worked in the past.
It's difficult. I think the UFO community as a whole has a wide variety of beliefs that are not scientifically founded, and we don't have the evidence does not exist for those beliefs, and it's unfortunate. I would like there to be evidence for some of these things, and some of these beliefs are interesting, and I find some of this fascinating, but I call it a mythology. I try to understand this mythology. I like to I like to hear about some of these anecdotes, and some of them are really fascinating, but it's important to realize, it's important to keep in mind that this is what we know is different. And for me, it isn't about belief. And I've had people ask me in interviews, do you believe that aliens are visiting Earth? And it doesn't matter what I believe. I want to know if they're visiting Earth. I want something more concrete, more powerful. And I think the best thing anybody can do is to talk to their senators and congressmen and try to emphasize that this data should be shared with the scientific community. Once you get scientists involved, nobody's going to be able to stop them. I mean, and once scientists, once we figure out how to collect data on some of these things, and we find out it's interesting, the discoveries are going to happen, and they'll happen fast. I mean, scientists will dive on board, and they'll drop what they're doing, and they'll run to solve this problem, because it's potentially one of the most interesting discoveries ever. So who wouldn't want to work on that?
And speaking of myths, I mean, a lot of some UFO people will hear that and say, oh, yeah, right. Like who? NASA? They're lying about us, about everything. Everybody's lying. The scientific community is hiding everything, that whenever they find something, an alien bodies, they just hide it. They believe that the entire scientific community essentially is part of this cover up. Whereas I argue the opposite, especially like with NASA. I mean, the NASA has a lot of citizen scientist programs which are very successful. People are finding meteorites and comets and getting them named after themselves and all of this sort of thing. Science, especially in astronomy, doesn't work the way that conspiracy-minded people think it does.
No, yeah.
I mean, how important is data sharing amongst scientists, especially when it comes to like astronomy?
Oh, it depends. Data's usually pretty freely shared. I've found my colleagues to be quite helpful. Some of the data's open. So, for example, I do work on characterizing exoplanets, planets orbiting other stars, and we use data from the Kepler Space Telescope, and that's all online. I mean, anybody can go. I can show you how. You can go and download data from the Kepler Space Telescope. Sure, anybody can. It's all online. It's it's produced by NASA. It's been paid for by the American taxpayer, and it's freely available to the American taxpayer. Anybody can, it's freely available to anybody on the planet, really. And and that's the data I use, to do my work on exoplanets. But, sometimes we need other data. And so I have in the past contacted, colleagues and said, do you have any data on this star? We'd like to get some of these measurements from this star. And usually it's like, no, we don't. But, I have a little extra time on the telescope tonight, and I'll swing over and I'll collect some data for you and send it to you in the morning. I've had that happen. And so they're more than willing to do that. And people are generally very eager to work together.
Well, we've taken up a lot of your time. I think we've gotten to most of the topics everybody's been talking about. They've been loving it and having a great time. I did want to show one image, and let me get this up, and it's fitting for the time that we're in, and you'll see why when I bring this up, because this here was one of your slides, and I love it because it's almost Halloween, and it says here this was your display in your yard for Halloween. Was that last year?
No, this photo was taken a few years ago. I've had the UFO put up a few years in a row. Yeah, it's in
Are
my
you putting
garage
it up
in
this
pieces
year?
right now. Probably not this year. I'm a little. I'll be honest. My neighbors all ask me if I'm going to put it out, and they seem to be eager for it to be on display. But I'm truth be told, I'm a little UFO'd out at this point. I had first built this as a project with my son and daughter a few years ago before I really actually started working on UFOs. But now I think now that was a little too close to home, and it feels a little weird. I don't want people to. My neighbors are going to think he's a real nut. He studies UFOs and he puts one on his lawn all the time.
It's so funny you say that because I shy away from like UFO shirts and t-shirts and stuff for the same reason. And it's like, I don't want to be that guy because I look into it doesn't mean I'm obsessed. And I don't want to look like I'm obsessed.
That's
or
right.
something.
That's right.
That's funny. Well, that's great. That's really cool. Well, thank you very much. I mean, right now in this time and age, I mean, it's very exciting, obviously, and you seem to enjoy getting involved. And I've noticed, at the Congress, you did purchase a T-shirt or two.
I have a sweatshirt. Yep.
Yeah, they're pretty cool. So, I mean, how do you, in your mind, a lot of people in the UFO community, for example, believe that, this is all leading to some kind of major disclosure of the UFO in a hangar and the Roswell alien. People in the public, I think a lot of people in the public, like your colleagues that you've been talking about, don't know what to make heads or tails of what the heck's going on with all of this. But then you have the Senate Intelligence Committee saying, okay, we want to know more, and we want you to provide the public with some more information. Where do you see all this heading, and do you have a positive kind of outlook towards where we're headed with all this?
I do generally. I think that this is all positive. Every time there's some kind of disclosure, anytime another pilot comes forward, anytime we have one of these things happen, it seems to have a snowballing effect. More people get involved. More, I get contacts from more scientists. Oh, I saw you study these things. What can I do to help? What could I do? And I think there's people who are really interested. And so I think that we very well will eventually get to the bottom of this, and we'll find out what's going on. Is it going to be what some of the people in the UFO community thought was going on? I don't know. We'll find out. I would be very excited if we were being visited by somebody from somewhere else. I think that would be very exciting. Of course, it would be one of the biggest discoveries in human history that we're not alone, and then of course the fact that they have craft that can travel to other stars means that that's something we should be able to pull off too, and that I find also exciting. So I am hopeful, and I think that there are some questions that need to be answered here, and I think that scientists should get involved and look into this. But I think it's important to keep in mind that we don't know what these especially these really anomalous, interesting cases are. We don't know what these objects are, and to prove that they are, to determine whether something is extraterrestrial is actually very difficult to do. It's not going to be easy. I often joke that, and yes, you can do an isotope analysis and things like this, but there's always, going to be some question. And I joke with my, friends and colleagues that it's almost going to take dragging a living alien kicking and screaming off his spacecraft and holding him up for everyone to see for people to finally accept, this is what's happening, and I think it might just take something crazy like that for people for that to be believed, if that is the case of what's going on.
And go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, and whether our government or other governments do possess crash craft and technology and things like this, that's an interesting question, and I'm on the fence. I'm not sure what I believe. I worry because the number of crashes appears to be quite high, and I would worry about their ability to fly their spacecraft if they're crashing that often.
Yeah.
I'm very skeptical that there really are that many crashes, and if any, and so but
Yeah, they'd be happening all the time.
It's exciting. Yeah, they would be happening all the time.
They're like, hey, can you jumpstart me? We gotta.
That's right.
But I guess the last question would be, because now that you've mentioned all this, the other aspect is if that is true too. They've got the UFO and the alien in the hangar. Because of the nature of the more secret, the less people involved and the less scientists involved, most likely then there isn't a lot of science being done. If that's
my guess is there's very little known, if they are working on, if they do have crash craft, if they do have data, I'm guessing that very little is actually known about these things. And it's probably so compartmentalized, it literally is going to be a handful of people.
Mm-hmm. And which is the scenario that Eric Davis gave, who is a contractor, and he says that's what he hears out there. So who knows, I guess, huh?
Yeah, it's not, when we say things like the government knows, well, the government isn't really a thing. So it's a poorly worded statement. There may be people who work, for the government or military or defense contractors who may know a few things, but they probably, you probably have several different sets of people. Each group knows, each group is just a handful of people who knows one little piece of something, and they probably don't communicate and probably can't put it all together, which is really the problem for, that's what happens when you do work like that and you don't collaborate.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I think I've had some sort of missing time experience because it's been an hour and a half and it feels like it's only been 15 minutes. I know. I can't believe the time flew.
It's been great fun. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's been a great time. Thank you so much for joining, and we'll be in touch. And I guess, is there a website or anything that you want to send people to look at?
I have a website with my research and some of my exoplanet work. It's at Knuth, which is my last name, Knuth, lab.org. And you can go there, stop by and see what I'm doing. I don't have any of the UFO stuff there yet. I probably will at some point.
All right. And it is pronounced Knuth. I think I've asked you that before. But it's funny because I had a meeting. Well, we had an SU meeting, and your name came up a couple of times and things you're helping out with. And some people say Knuth, some say Knuth. There's some people
Scandinavian pronunciation, so the K is pronounced.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And I guess people can look on my social media to see that story from space.com that you were in recently. A great article. I think that was a really good one. And if you enjoyed this interview, please push the like button and also subscribe to the channel. Because if you subscribe, you'll get notified, especially if you hit the little bell whenever I do these live streams, so you can pop in. And like I said, the live streams, you can come join, communicate, get involved with us, and ask your questions and interact. And then later, these do go into the archive. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you so much, Kevin.
Thank you.
We'll be in touch. You have a great evening.
All right, thank you. You too.
All right, let me find one of my cool little videos. Here we go.